Welcome to Praxis. I'm Olivia Rousset. I'd like to welcome our audience here in Sydney, as well as those joining us on video link from Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, and those of you watching on APAC online or listening on radio. Today we're discussing the future of Pacific Island nations. The Pacific is a unique and diverse region. It has 9 million people scattered across a third of the globe's surface, over a tiny fraction of its land. It's home to some of the world's smallest, most isolated and environmentally vulnerable countries. With the exception of Papua New Guinea, all Pacific Island Forum countries are among the world's 50 smallest countries. Populations are scattered, and costs of running services like schools and hospitals are high. These small island states now comprise the least developed countries outside of Africa. Solomon Islands is made up of nearly 900 islands, while Kiribati is spread across an area of ocean roughly half the size of Australia, with just 190th of its population. Despite this, there have been major successes. Since independence, Pacific Island countries have achieved real progress. Life expectancy has increased, infant mortality rates have declined, and less people are struck with infectious disease. However, economic growth has been well below the global average for developing countries. In the last century, many countries have overcome poverty by moving from an agriculture-led economy to an export-based one. But in the Pacific, there are many barriers to such a path: isolation, poor infrastructure and transport, and in some cases, a lack of resources to export. For many people, farming is often the only means of survival. The World Bank's recent Pacific Futures Report proposes a rethinking of conventional development approaches for Pacific Island countries, including how we look at development success. So what will the Pacific look like in 30 years? What role will aid play? What about the traditional economies, private sector and trade? And finally, how do we measure prosperity and happiness? Is economic growth the key factor? To discuss this and more, we have Rob Tranter, the head of AusAID's Pacific Division, Biman Prasad, a professor of economics at the University of the South Pacific, Ferid Belhaj, who's the country director for the World Bank in Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea and the Pacific Islands, and Ralph Regenvanu, who has flown from Vanuatu to join us today. Ralph is a member of Parliament in Vanuatu. I'd like to start with you, Rob. How would you like to see the Pacific region in 30 years?
I think I'd like to see a Pacific region where Pacific Island governments and communities are leading their own development, where they're making faster progress in translating the strength in their own natural and human resources into better services for their people, taking advantage of a region which is more highly integrated and connected, where people have got the opportunity to have the skills which are recognised in the region and to be able to live and work and make a contribution in their own communities. And for the future, I think that means looking at things like the cost of service delivery, facilitating linkages in the region, and I think I have to say, as given where I come from, a smaller role for aid in the future.
Mm-hmm. Biman?
Yeah, I see the Pacific in the next 30 years one which will be highly integrated among themselves through communication strategies, ICT, transport, aviation, and not only integrating among themselves, but highly integrated with Australia and New Zealand. Australia and New Zealand are the two richest neighbours for the Pacific, and they're likely to remain so for the next 30 or 40 years. And I think the integration amongst the Pacific Island countries will provide them with opportunities to address some of the challenges of isolation, challenges for opening up and benefiting from the international and global markets.
Ferid, what kind of Pacific would you like to see in 30 years?
Look, 30 years starts today. Huh? So whatever we are building today, we will see in 30 years. If one looks at the region today, one looks at a very dynamic region, a region that is transforming itself into the growth driver of the world economically. It is a region where geostrategically we are looking at very interesting dynamics. It's a region that is moving very, very fast towards prosperity. It's a region that includes huge economies, from China to going down all the way to Australia, prosperous economies. And the problem is that today, the countries we are dealing with, the countries we are talking about, those small island countries, these countries suffering from isolation, from remoteness, from weak capacity, from a lot of the adverse effects of climate change, the aggression of climate change, those countries are not partaking into this big potential. So the choice is dual, basically. The choice is either, as Rob and Biman said, integration, moving forward to try to address the challenges of remoteness, the challenges of isolation, and look at the region as a huge potential for bringing people and countries together, getting them closer to some of the nearest large markets. We are talking about Australia, for instance, a huge potential there. The second choice would be to say, no, we are going to maintain our superb isolation and focused on whatever we are and whatever we have today. And if the choice is the second one, in 30 years, well, we would have missed the train of progress, and that train would have passed by without looking. If the choice is the former, then we would be looking at a prosperous, more integrated region with people finally, again, partaking into the prosperity that is now part and parcel of the growth that this region is bringing to everybody.
And Ralph, what would you like to see the Pacific become in 30 years? What kind of Pacific?
I think we need to build on our strengths. And the Pacific Island countries have been around for the populations in my area, from Vanuatu east, 3,000 years. We've been living in this region, dealing with the climate, the environment, building our societies. And there are a lot of strengths we have. I mean, we are some of the societies with the least homelessness in the world. In terms of real poverty, hunger, there's very little, if any. These are great strengths we have, and we need to build on those strengths, enhance them by working out better ways of governing ourselves, and I'm talking about from community level right up to national level. And we're facing big problems right now at national level with dealing with political governance, new models that have come in. So there's a lot of work to be done with political reform. But essentially so that Pacific people in the future have a very wide range of choices of what they can do and options they have for moving into the future. Both options that come from our traditions that very much are the centre part of most Pacific Islanders' lives today, as well as the options that come from technology and greater integration and those kind of things. And it's very important right now that we strike the right balance.
What are, Ferid mentioned some of the challenges such as climate change and isolation. What are the challenges that you, as you see them?
The challenges are, I think that the big challenge is being able to make decisions for ourselves that incorporate all the stakeholders in a society. And you're talking about communities who are, for example, land-holding entities like tribes, which is the normal unit of organisation in most Pacific Island countries, being able to make decisions that represent the interests of both male and female members of this community, young people, children, able to make decisions that can be reflected up to national level and internationally as well. Being able to make well-informed choices that are informed by not only the best awareness that comes from a good education system and so on, but also some sort of critical evaluation of what's happening in the world as a whole. And I think the experience of a country like Vanuatu during the global financial crisis, for example, most people in the country didn't affect them. And that's a strength we had compared to some of the more developed countries where the impact was huge on people's lives. So we need to figure out how did we maintain that resilience? How do we maintain it but still provide the best outcomes for, especially social outcomes for our people?
We'll come back to that a bit later. Biman, I'd like to ask you, what are the opportunities as you see them in the Pacific for private sector development?
I think there are a lot of opportunities for the Pacific Island, and I go back to what Ferid was saying earlier, and I want to bring back this idea of economic integration. I think, the Pacific, I term it as a luxury of limited choice. Because we are isolated, because we are at a distance from major markets, we have a luxury of few limited choices that we can make. And one of them, of course, is to look at how we can integrate much more. How we can use the technology, and here I want to talk about the development of ICT. And the Pacific, I think, has a lot of opportunity for what I call weightless exports. I mean, while we may not be able to compete with the larger countries, especially engaged in manufacturing, but the Pacific can be a very good place for people, for professionals, for artisans, for those kind of people who want to provide the kind of services that we can export. I mean, we could export professional, legal, accounting, engineering, design, editorial, all these kind of services down broadband connectivity. So really, I think being isolated, being small, does provide us with a limited choice, but they are very, very important choices, and one that would require investment in those kind of infrastructure. And so Pacific Island countries, in my view, have real opportunity without, of course, compromising issues like environment. I think tourism-based economies will have to find out that it is very, very important that we look after our environment, make sure that we have the appropriate conservation and preservation policies. But the point I'm trying to make is that being isolated, being small, does not preclude us from exploiting the opportunities that exist as a result of a new global environment. And in my view, I think a lot of the ideas for that kind of approach can come through a much more meaningful and deeper integration amongst the Pacific Island countries, where they can share their knowledge, where they can share their problems, look at integration and how it can reduce the cost of providing basic services, how it can reduce the cost of doing business, and at the same time looking at Australia and New Zealand, because as I said, these two countries are big and rich countries, and they provide a lot of opportunities for the Pacific Island countries to be able to exploit those markets. So I see a lot of opportunity, and I see a lot of optimism going forward in that direction.
There's also resources too, isn't it, Ferid? Could you talk a bit about the fisheries? I believe that in the Pacific is it a third or of the world's tuna stocks?
The fisheries discussion is a strategic one. It has the potential of becoming a transformational drive in this part of the world. We are looking very seriously into this particular area of activity. But let me go back to a couple of issues that I'd like to put on the table as part of this dialogue. We mentioned some of the challenges that the region is facing, and those challenges today are looked at, thought through by the Pacific Island countries and societies, and by the international community at large. Before we started here, we were discussing. I was saying that the challenges of climate change, the challenges of remoteness, isolation, etc. All those challenges can be managed by a particular country when they are striking you as one challenge in a way. If one country or one region can have an issue with climate change, or can have an issue with isolation or remoteness or weak capacity. But this is a region that is managing a large number of those challenges at the same time. And being optimistic the way you are is absolutely admirable. Because when you look today, at the same time, we are dealing with the remoteness and economic geography. We are dealing with countries that are facing existential threats through climate change. And we are looking at countries that have a very difficult time getting their economy to be sustainable precisely because of the fact that they are extremely far away from any place where they can export their merchandises, for instance, or where they can do something that would be leading to growth. Listening to Biman is actually a light of hope, because yes, it is true that this is one of the choices that these countries have. In addition to how to exploiting and taking advantage of some of the potential. You mentioned fisheries, mining, energy. We see huge potential in this part of the world, and this huge potential needs to be tapped into. Now the issue is how to tap into that huge potential while keeping the balance that Ralph was talking about, and on which I totally agree. There is a need, not to make sure that we are not sweeping, what these countries are all about. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we are not totally, blocked and unable to reach out and to, in particular, to get advantage of the huge opportunities that I was mentioning earlier in terms of a region that is really moving forward and becoming the center of gravity of economic center of gravity of the world.
Ralph, is that how you see things? Do you see the Pacific as having that kind of potential for private sector investment to bring it forward, to grow it economically?
I'm very much interested in growing our domestic private sectors. I think that's the way forward. In terms of, I'm a MP from Vanuatu. I would hate to purport to speak on behalf of the Pacific because I don't really know most of the Pacific. I know my country, I know a few other countries. The Pacific's very different countries. For example, Papua New Guinea, totally different animal to Vanuatu. Huge mineral resources, gas, oil. Vanuatu has nothing like that. We have no forest to speak of. So when you talk about these kind of things, I feel reluctant to talk about the Pacific. I know that there are common principles in all our societies. But one thing I do recognize, especially in the Melanesian countries, is that our human resources, as Biman was saying, that's our major asset. Our major asset is our people, and more integration of our people as economic agents is something that in Vanuatu we have no history, unlike the Polynesian countries, of our populations living abroad and remittances. That's a big feature of the Polynesian countries, remittance-based economies. Vanuatu, no experience of that. But just recently, we've started to go into this seasonal employment scheme in New Zealand, and that's been a major positive factor. Mm-hmm. It's brought things like water supply to remote communities where they have no other means of getting it, through normal development processes. But you have people in these communities who don't have the requisite skills in terms of, the standard model of you get educated, you get a, certificate, you get a job. They actually come straight from the village to work, and the money they get is many more times what they would get for the equivalent skills in Vanuatu. And they're able to go back and really improve the quality of life, just for basic things, water tanks, get one building that has a corrugated iron roof to collect water, that kind of thing. And so, one of the things that people in Vanuatu are looking towards is more seasonal employment. New Zealand, Australia. We were very disappointed at Australia's response this last month. Peanuts.
It's around 2,000. Rob, do you know the seasonal worker?
2,500.
2,500.
And the commitment
New
from the
Zealand's
Australian government is to make that pilot scheme a permanent scheme, and it's extended it to another 5 countries. And I agree with Ralph, but the pilot phase in the Australian scheme demonstrate the value of supporting people to be able to work overseas in the metropolitan countries in the region. And in an evaluation that we did with the World Bank, I think the average income earned for someone on the seasonal worker scheme was about $12,000, of which $5,000 was remitted back home, which is a really terrific contribution to people's families and communities. And I think we can expect to see more of these sorts of opportunities for Pacific Islanders, particularly as we move down the path of strengthening higher education, investing in skills, and taking a regional approach to the delivery of public goods, such as higher education. For example, the Australia Pacific Technical College is a resource where people are trained to an Australian standard. Those qualifications are then recognised in the region. People graduate from that college with an Australian qualification at a certificate level 3 or certificate level 4, which as a trade skill allows people to win work and access visas in the Australian or New Zealand system. And these sorts of initiatives, I think, are really powerful ones. Unfortunately, in the region, we see fewer Pacific Islanders winning work in the sort of traditional vocations in the remittance industries, such as seafaring. I think the number of Tavaloans now working on ships overseas is below 100, and we're not seeing enough Pacific Islanders being able to take advantage of the mining boom in Solomon Islands and PNG and Australia. And again, these are things happening in the region. There's potential being realised. The region's growing in PNG, sols elsewhere, but investing in skills in ways that where people can be recognised for their qualifications is a really powerful way to be able for them to access those markets.
And
I just wanted to add, Olivia, I think this whole issue of remittances and labour mobility, that's part of the bigger agenda for integration. And this is what I was saying, for many of the Pacific Island countries, not only integration among themselves, but integration with Australia and New Zealand is very, very important to look at that particular issue. The recent MSG agreement on labour mobility would address some of the issues relating to movement of labour from, say, Fiji to Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu to Papua New Guinea. Within the Pacific Island countries, I think there is that potential. And once I think that in some ways it's already happening. For example, teachers are now going to Marshall Islands. There's a possibility of teachers going to Vanuatu, to Solomons to address this shortage. Will come through those kind of agreements. But I think the important point, Rob, that you made, and Ralph also made, is the reluctance of Australia and New Zealand to actually see labour mobility, see the role of remittances as an important contribution to the economies of the Pacific Island. Fiji, for example, if you look at what happened in the last 5 years, where the average growth rate has been less than 1%, the economy basically was kept afloat through large flow of remittances, and mainly from Australia and New Zealand. And these are people who have left Fiji as migrants, but also those who find work temporarily in those countries. So it is a very, very important issue.
I think Tonga's GDP is made up 30% of remittances. All of the integration and educational opportunities aside, most of the people in the Pacific are engaged in smallholder or subsistence agriculture and fishing. Rob, what does the future for them look like?
Well, I think it looks very positive. I think if you examine the history of the informal sector in the Pacific, it's been the great driver of growth and welfare in communities. If you have a look at, you mentioned at the outset, Olivia, the improvements in the standard of, in people's life expectancy and health indicators generally in the region, which are very dramatic increases from the 1950s through to the early 1990s. Which can partly be explained by improvements in technology, but it came at a time when there wasn't particularly great growth in those economies. So the strength of the informal sector and what has been happening in Pacific Island communities is a recognised driver of that welfare and is the social safety net for Pacific Island communities. In terms of looking to the future, I think the comparative advantage of the region, as Ralph said, it's very difficult to generalise. And when we look across the region and we think about agriculture and the contribution of fisheries, and in some cases we're talking about very large enterprises, elsewhere we're talking about smallholder and much smaller enterprises. But it's a niche product. And the comparative advantage for the Pacific region is to have that niche product recognised in much larger markets, whether it's in the United States or Australia or New Zealand. I think there's been some really interesting initiatives which have been taken here to sort of underline the value of the product. You know, people attach a great premium to organic produce. We've seen the great success of things like Fiji water, excuse me. But you know, doing small things like supporting countries to gain an organic certification for the beef industry, has happened for Vanuatu, for example, enabled pristine beef to be exported through the region with quite big impacts to smallholder beef graziers. So I think the prospects are strong. I think there are things that need to be done to support those smallholders, and the bottom line, I think, is about supporting market access and being able to facilitate, again, this coming back to this theme of integration within the region.
Okay. Ferid, elsewhere a lot of countries have moved out of poverty through industrialisation. Are there opportunities like that for Pacific Island countries, do you believe?
Well, I guess there are many opportunities. Yes, there is that kind of opportunity, and obviously, one should not look at the countries we are talking about as
one block.
As one block. As Ralph said, absolutely right. Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands are at a different level in terms of how much they can exploit some of their resources and how much can they make that transition to a more industrialized type of economy. Other places are facing totally different challenges. So I guess it is a variable geometry type of an approach that one should look at.
Somewhere like Vanuatu, say, would the private sector be able to grow enough to support,
the issue of the role of the private sector in very small economy is quite an interesting discussion to have. How much of a driver is the private sector in a place where competition is rather constrained by the sheer number of people and the sheer capacity of those people to create businesses? There is a big role to be played by the public sector in these countries, in fact. And there is a big role to be played by the public sector as a driver of growth in conjunction with the private sector that is there. But again, it's not one size fits all. If you look at PNG, and on PNG, for instance, we have developed an interesting mechanism to allow small and medium enterprises to get access to finance. It's a risk-sharing facility that we are putting together with our private sector arm, the International Finance Corporation. And that is quite interesting because we are basically, taking advantage of something that's happening today in PNG, and that is the big liquefied natural gas project that is being launched there, and that could be, really transformational for the country. But that's not just the project. There are many other opportunities around that project that can be created by micro or medium or small enterprises. The thing is that those entrepreneurs don't necessarily have access to finance. So what the bank has done with the government of PNG is put together a scheme that would allow them to get access to that finance. We are seeing the first signs of success for this project. So our aim now is to enlarge it to other countries around the Pacific, Vanuatu being one potential candidate, Solomon Islands being another potential candidate. So the discussion about private sector is, to be looked at carefully, to be looked at as a big potential, but also a potential that is not necessarily to be discussed and approached the way we are discussing it and approaching it in much bigger economies elsewhere.
Biman.
Yeah, I think it's an important issue. You know, my own view is that there is potential for private sector, and I like what Ralph was saying, that we need to concentrate on domestic, small, medium enterprises which are engaged in the private sector activity. I think a lot of emphasis, a lot of regulatory emphasis and laws that have come about as a result of support, unfortunately, from the donors as well, to actually look at big businesses, but not looking at how small, medium enterprises which can integrate themselves into the larger private sector. For example, we don't want our mothers and sisters to just weave baskets for tourists coming out of the cruise ships. We want them to link the production of those baskets, those artifacts, to markets in Australia and New Zealand where they can have broadband facilities, they can market those on the internet, they can really participate in the broader economy. And I think some of the regulatory mechanisms and support that are given to the Pacific Island countries reflects the emphasis on large entities. I think we have to be size sensitive. I mean, you can't expect a restaurant which has 100 chairs or a restaurant with only 2 chairs compared to a restaurant with 100 chairs, following the same kind of regulatory requirements and process to register a business. So I think there is, I mean, I understand there are a lot of differences in the shape and size of countries, but I think even if you look at smaller countries, there is a potential of integrating, domestic, small, medium enterprises into the larger private sector. And let me just make a quick comment on the role of ICT. I think there is also a presence of what I call anti-growth coalition in many of these countries, where you have the public service, where you have monopolistic structures, large businesses, which collude to keep the regulations, keep the environment in favor of themselves, without actually allowing a lot of these small businesses to integrate and make sure that they are able to develop themselves as part of the broader economy. I think when we're talking about private sector, we need to talk about taking those small, medium enterprises, those who do not have the opportunity of finance, and I think Ferid talked about that, and that kind of support and program is good, where you are able to provide those kind of. So really, at the end of the day, you are saying to these small and medium enterprises and people who want to get into businesses and enjoy the benefits of the private sector, to integrate themselves into the broader economy, and that can be done if the enabling environment, starting from legislation, from government support, is present. And unfortunately, that anti-growth or broad participation coalition stops this thing happening. And even in ICT, people are saying to me that you can't have more than 2 players for mobile phones in Fiji. I mean, you look at countries like Denmark, you look at countries like Hungary, which is kind of a virtual heart of Europe. I mean, small in relative terms in Europe, but these countries have been able to create the kind of competition in the provision of ICT. And to me, ICT services, ICT infrastructure is like road, water supply, or electricity these days. If you want to make sure that people participate in the broader economy in the Pacific, and this is where I talk about this luxury of limited choice. And if we concentrate on that, we can actually address this whole issue of whether private sector can play an important role and in a different way.
I'd like to go to Ralph just quickly. Recently, Vanuatu joined the World Trade Organization, and you've actively campaigned for Vanuatu to leave the WTO, and no country ever has left the organisation. Why is that?
Well, I actually was opposed to us joining. Mm-hmm. I know that leaving is pretty unrealistic, but
why?
I was opposed to us joining because I didn't think we got a good deal. The deal we got was And the deals that LDCs get in the WTO are not good.
LDCs, least developed
least developed countries, sorry. There's this new round of, LDC accession guidelines that have been put up, which, talk about 50% bound rates on 100% of agricultural products. So really just totally unfavourable and totally hypocritical too, considering what developed countries had when they went through the same process. So I think you need to look at the realities of what's happening, like in a country like Vanuatu. And when you talk about trade agreements, for example, in the Pacific, we've had a decade of negotiating with Europe for the Economic Partnership Agreement. What's the outcome of that decade of negotiation? Pretty much it's changed rules of origin for canned tuna from PNG. That's what it is. And so now you're having tuna fleets from the Philippines coming and fishing in PNG waters, setting up tuna factories in PNG, marketing tuna caught by Filipino officials through Filipino factories to Europe. And this won't last long because the preferential trade has got to at some point close because the tuna stocks are going down. And then we've had a study done by an academic here in Sydney showing that the people working in those tuna factories are getting less than the women working on their own land selling vegetables in the roadside market.
Do you see the kind of integration and private sector development that Biman's talking about as being a threat to the small, Pacific Island nation's sovereignty?
I see, there are different levels, right? I think in information communication technologies, we don't have anything in our countries like that. We're now just starting the new startups, Young people are getting into web services, IT services, as a result of big multinationals bringing those services in. But we couldn't have done it ourselves. So there are levels of private sector that we need to come in to provide opportunities. But I think in terms of food processing, that's a huge area I see as a future for the Pacific. Why? Because 90% of Pacific populations are involved in agriculture. So it's a sector we should be targeting to involve the population. When you talk about mining or stuff like that, that's really kind of very little limited. The population has never been engaged in this. It's going to only engage a very limited amount of people in something they've never done before. Whereas agriculture, you're talking about something that people live with every day, smallholder agriculture, and it's something that we need to put a lot more emphasis on. And unfortunately, no one's talking about agriculture, it seems. Everyone's talking about resource extraction, aid, blah, blah, blah. But agriculture is something which I think is a good example of somewhere we need to try and work on the local private sector and be very careful about, there's all these issues of food security, food sovereignty. The Pacific is one of the areas with some of the highest, obesity rates in the world, that kind of thing. It's a huge health problem in the Pacific, is imported food. And that's the reality. People are dying from lower prices for imported food, which aren't contributing really anything to quality of life. So why are we going down that road? Why don't we try and develop local food industries based on nutritional food that we have grown for centuries and we know how to prepare and use? Why don't we try and protect those industries? Heaven forbid use the word protect, but yeah. Grow those industries as a way of, substituting for all this Australian rice and stuff like this coming in, as a way of building our economy, which is really going to benefit everyone right down to the grassroots.
Ferid?
Yeah, just a couple of words on agriculture. Totally agree, and this is why the bank has developed a number of projects, precisely dealing for instance with smallholder agriculture and making sure that we bridge the gap between the private sector and the need to secure food security and the need to develop an agricultural industry that would be not only directed towards the self-sufficiency, but also possibly towards export. A couple of other issues. One on the discussion about access to finance and the environment for private sector development. I think it is absolutely important. It's at the heart of what we are all talking about. I mentioned the risk-sharing facility. It is a dry kind of way of saying that there is a lot of accompanying measures, including building capacity for small and medium enterprises, how to prepare a business plan, how to work on a predictable cash flow, how to develop a way of putting together a business, and by putting together a business, bring to everybody's attention some of the difficulties and allowing the government, some of the donors, to look at those difficulties and raise the flag whenever there is an issue. And one last point on the WTO, and we can have a long discussion about it. But at the end of the day, having bilateral trade agreements hasn't been that much of a great deal for very small developing countries. So the WTO came as an alternative, try to kind of put in a cooperative way the broad discussion about on trade. Nothing is perfect, and we can see it today. I mean, the all the rounds we're talking about, the Doha round is at a standstill, and there is nothing coming out of it up to now, and people are reaching the verge of desperation about it. But there is a dynamic, a multilateral dynamic, which sitting where I sit here, and I truly believe it, has something good to put on the table for the small and for the weakest economies that we are dealing with. Bilateral is good, multilateral is much better.
Okay, I'd like, Biman, what would you
like? I supported. In fact, I support the 6 Pacific Island countries which are now members of the WTO. I think it's a good thing, and simply from the point of view of the fact that the Pacific Island countries, I think there is too much introspection. I think we are sinking with the weight of that kind of introspection in looking at what the Pacific Island countries themselves, ought to do, in terms of the agriculture, in terms of the traditional economy, without actually looking at the opportunities that exist for these countries, beyond the Pacific and beyond themselves. And I'm not saying for a moment that WTO provisions and the failure of the Doha round to address issues that are directly affecting the LDCs are not important. I think the failure of the Doha round and failure of some of the developed countries in dealing with some of those issues are important. But I think even taking that out from the equation, the fact that these countries are now members of the WTO, they are able to look beyond the Pacific, look at the issues of technology, look at the issues of integration, and the opportunities that I talked about earlier can be realized and exploited without damaging the environment, without compromising the cultural and traditional fabrics of our society. I think many of these societies, while understanding that they need to protect the culture and tradition and environment, are also living a life which is much more integrated, with modern technology and with modern ideas. So I think trade agreements and being a member of WTO, and I think the Pacific now has a critical mass of 6 countries. And as a group, these 6 countries can address some of the issues that Ralph has been talking about, and I think they can use that grouping, use that idea of sovereignty, collectively, to get the developed countries and the partnership that they have with them to help them address some of those issues that are holding them back. So I see it as a very positive. And let me also say that Pacific Island leaders and Pacific Island trade officials, to the contrary view, have been good. I think these people understand, the situation in their country, and I think to their credit, they have articulated the views of the Pacific Island countries within the WTO, within these forums in a much better way. So I think we need to give them credit for that.
Do you, Ralph, now that Vanuatu is in the WTO, do you see that kind of potential, positive potential that Biman's talking about?
Possibly. We don't really know what we're in for in many ways. So we will see what will come. It could be disaster. It could be, who knows, you know. We are now in that arena. We could be taken to court any day by a group of high-powered American lawyers to take away customary land ownership. I mean, who knows? You know, we've opened the door now. So we will have to see as it comes.
Where is the line? Because it's sort of some change. You've talked about telecommunications have been positive. Other changes, there's a lot more, say, fear attached to or tentativeness to do with change. Where do you position yourself in seeing what's good and bad? What's the measure of that?
We need to be pragmatic. I mean, the thing is, we need to get away from all these orthodoxies about that's the way or this way. And that's what I liked about the Pacific Futures, was that it said, okay, this frame of thinking is not working. Let's try and adjust our frame of thinking. Unlike my colleagues here, I mean, I don't come from that economic background. And I think you just need to look at what's happening on the ground, what's really happening in our societies, in our communities. We have a situation, for example, in Vanuatu where young people say, we don't want to work for other people. We don't want to be employees. Being an employee in Vanuatu is terrible. We want to have our own businesses. And they say that, and they've been saying that consistently for a long time. So how do we provide these young people with the opportunity to have businesses in a context where, you know, there are strengths for what they can do right now? And one good example is, you know, having a little trade store, okay, in your community is something that a lot of people can do as a start to working out business plans, how to have a cash flow and something. But in the constituency I come from, which is Port Vila, the capital and main city of Vanuatu, we have a situation where, you know, foreign-owned retail stores or trade stores are now taking over the capital. So the opportunity for these young people to do one of the few things they know how to do is being prevented by government policy. And some of us are saying, look what happened in the Solomon Islands. Look what happened in Papua New Guinea. Look what happened in Indonesia. You know, riots in Chinatown. And what are we doing? Have we learned anything? Why are we going down this same road? It's because of that economic orthodoxy thinking that you can't sort of break out of that mold and think, you know, there's another way to do things. And I think also this autonomy that comes from the strength of the traditional economy, the fact that people in rural areas can choose to go to New Zealand, work for 6 months, come back to the island, improve their standard of living, and they don't want to go and work. They want to be able to, you know, it's a much more. There are much more choices in your life when the traditional economy is strong. You're not a wage slave. You're not predestined to have to pay off a mortgage for all your life. You know.
Do you still see a role for aid?
Absolutely.
What is that role?
Well, it's there's an historical debt that Australia owes to Vanuatu, in particular, for us building up your economy with our people that came over. But also, of course, you know, just the fact that it's a very rich society, we're a very poor society in terms of, you know, cash, and there are things that we need, and Australia's committed to providing aid and assisting the Pacific Island countries. There's a lot that can be done better, but I'm sure that we're all working on how to make aid better, so that, you know, we can have better Western medicine, health facilities, better water supply, better school education environments, and those kind of things.
A few years ago, you, in a BBC article, you criticised development organisations such as the World Bank for having a money-focused attitude and wanting to make as much money as quickly as possible. And you said there are alternative strategies, such as traditional economies. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yes, I think the Vanuatu has been like most of the world in this development mindset where economic growth is the be-all and end-all, and I think that's just, I mean, it's just wrong. It's not right at all. Economic growth is not the be-all and end-all, and this whole idea of trickle-down doesn't work. It's proven. So it's important to look at social outcomes, you know, real things like life expectancy, you know, health, education, and how you get that is the question. I don't think you get it from economic growth necessarily. I mean, economic growth is this idea that maybe I don't know, but we get a lot of those outcomes from the traditional economy, and as Rob said,
could you define the traditional economy very briefly?
It's just the way in which majority of the most of the land in Vanuatu, for example, is under customary tenure. There's no cash involved in the way people obtain food, obtain materials to make their houses, govern themselves, law and order, provision of law and order by traditional authorities, all that stuff that's outside the cash economy, right? But it's based on centuries of tradition and how we've managed our environments and the way we interact with it. And I think that, as Rob was saying, there was that AusAID report that came out, that famous AusAID report that came out that said, Vanuatu since 1980 has grown 90% population. Economic growth's been like 2% and lately 5%. So where's all the support for this 90% population growth come from? And it's because the traditional economy has managed to absorb all that, feed everybody, house everybody, clothe everybody, make sure everyone has a little bit of cash for something. And at the same time, social outcomes have all been slowly increasing. We're now getting to the stage where we are starting to see social outcomes level off. And where is that happening? It's happening in the urban centres where the cash economy is centred. So in Port Vila is where you're going to find poverty, you're going to find all these new diseases coming in. The rate of amputation of limbs is really soaring, and this is in the main centres where all the cash is, where there isn't a traditional economy. So we need to start to look at really what's happening in our countries, and not just say, no, we've got to do this, we've got to do this, we've got to do this. We've got to say, look, there are many options we have in order to develop, and we've got to be able to use them all. And I think labour mobility is a very good one for us. We've seen that with New Zealand. We hope to see it more with Australia. It's a very good way for people in Vanuatu to choose to go and engage with the cash economy in a way that they're getting good return for their labour, which they can't do in Vanuatu. You can't get a good return for your labour if you're an unskilled labourer. You basically become a slave. So you get a good return for your unskilled labour for a short period, and then you go back and you're able to use that money to increase the standard of living for your community.
Ferid, would you like to?
I think you've set up, Ralph, on something that, anyway, the way you ask the question is a bit twisted, because obviously what his answer is something that we would all agree with. Of course, growth is not an be-all and end-all, and of course, growth is just one part of an overall development agenda. Growth is important because you need financing for human development. You need financing for health, for education. You need financing to get those unskilled people to acquire those skills and to be able to choose exactly what was said, to choose whether to go to the cash economy and to choose to sell their know-how, whether it is quote unquote in-house or to go abroad, and to instill another dynamic in the economy of a particular country. So I don't see growth and human development as antinomic. They are part and parcel of an overall comprehensive development framework, to go back to an old bank concept. So in that sense, I think we all agree on where our development agenda should be going.
Okay. I'd like to open to questions from the audience right now. We have some questions from Solomon Islands, but does anyone here have a question they'd like to open with? Not yet? Yep, we have one over here. Just wait for the microphone.
Good afternoon. My name is Carol Angir. I'm working with ActionAid Australia. And I would like to, first of all, appreciate your views that you've shared on the Pacific. But there's one thing that I've noted that's not coming clearly across all your conversations that I'm keen to learn more about and to hear more about, and that's how women are positioned in development and economic growth for the Pacific. I appreciate what Biman and Ralph have talked about in insinuating them as laborers and people who are, the smallholder smallholders and all. But for me, the bigger questions I'm asking is how women position in the economic development of Pacific, how are women positioned in the political participation and governance processes that determine some of the economic growth policies and economic strategies that work for communities in Pacific. And my third kind of area of interest is that if you're talking about economic growth and economic justice, what are some of the political commitments by the state and non-state actors on women in the Pacific?
Biman, would you like to?
Yeah, I think, thank you for your question. I think those are very, very important issues, and particularly the participation of women in the economy. As I said before, a lot of the women, the examples of where women are engaging in the economy is really in the small and medium enterprises, and many of them are constrained by the kind of anti-growth coalitions that I was talking about, where the legislations, where the support for women to engage in meaningful business enterprises, like those for small and medium enterprises generally, and because women form quite a part of that group, they usually find that they don't have the support and the enabling environment to participate. I think on the positive side, we can say that there is increasing political commitment. The role of women NGOs and women's organizations in the Pacific is much more visible, and I think many of them are doing some very, very interesting work in not only analyzing where women are, but also playing the advocacy role in making sure that women do participate in the economy in a much broader way, and also, for example, in the political process. I mean, we saw in Papua New Guinea for the first time there are 3 women in parliament. We are undergoing a constitutional consultation process in Fiji, and women's group are actively arguing for guaranteed representation, and they're looking at political parties, who would put women as candidates. So I think I'm optimistic about the future role of women in the economy and in the political process, and the role that they could play. And whatever we have right now, I think they are very, very effective.
Thanks,
So,
Biman.
Olivia, can I just say, Carol, I really welcome the question. I think if we were to envisage a future in 30 years' time, it has to involve, it has to be a future where women in the Pacific are being supported to play a much greater role in society and in their economies. And when we talk about the informal sector and produce markets, and if you go to any market in the Pacific, it's women who dominate in produce markets and often in the informal economy. And there was a fantastic World Bank report that was released last year, the World Development Report, which focused on the interests of women. And at a global level, it drew attention to the fact that there's about $47 billion lost from the world economy each year because of the barriers that are faced by women to not being able to contribute to their full potential in the region. And it's very complex problems, and something that the Australian government's very committed to doing something about. But it can't be just, there's no silver bullet. So supporting women to maximise their potential through earning income, we see that creating great tensions in households and in communities, and it becomes a catalyst for domestic violence. And we all know that there are very difficult problems in the region involving violence against women. And just to finish, all of us who've got an interest in the region would have been watching the PNG elections recently, where there's now 3 female MPs have been elected to the parliament, which is a terrific outcome, but 3 out of more than 100. And this part of the world has got the lowest representation of any region globally in terms of women in parliaments and in decision making generally. So it's an area where, as a region, we can all do better, and certainly an area where the Australian government and I know with our development partners are committed to working hard. I'd
just like to move to some of the questions that we've gotten from Solomon Islands. This one's to Ralph. As a leader from Anonymous, as a leader in one of the countries in the Pacific, what do you think it takes for the Pacific to reach the scenario you've just expressed, which is improved quality of life for all Pacific Islanders?
Better governance. You know, we need better political systems. We need to. I know that in Vanuatu we need that. We need better political systems that produce more responsive and representative government, and that's a big problem we're facing. And I don't, you know, it's something we need to work towards. And as I said at the beginning, not only at government national level, but that starts right at the community. We need to have communities that are well governed in a way that represent the views of everybody in them. And that's something we haven't achieved yet. I mean, some communities in the Pacific have done it very well. And some communities in Vanuatu are doing it very well. Others, long way from it. So we need to learn from the models that are around and learn from each other and try and develop these models where we can have better ways to make decisions about what we want to do with our lives.
And Ferid, there's a question for you from Willie. I'm not sure if it's Solomon Islands or Port Moresby, but there's also the challenge to mitigate the effect of external shocks, such as volatility in global energy prices. What's your view on that?
Well, how much time do you have?
Not much.
Well, look, if one looks at you know, as I was mentioning earlier, look at the overall challenges facing this part of the world. This is one of many. You know, the issue of volatility and the issue of vulnerability of very small countries to the fluctuation of you know, energy prices and frankly to the fluctuation of food prices and other products. When we talk about vulnerability in the Pacific, it is multidimensional, and the only way to manage it, or in our view, the best way to manage it is precisely to try to integrate more the economy, so that, you know, one can mitigate and in a way diffuse the impact of those shocks on the economies. Just one quick word on the issue of on the question that was asked by the Solomon Islands, I think, and the governance dimension, and I think it is absolutely true. It is at the center of, you know, what every country needs to take care of and to look at. We were talking earlier about a book called Why Nations Fail. Why nations succeed? They succeed because they have a strong and, you know, robust governance system that goes from the community level all the way to the top, and you know, it is in a way the counterfactual is terrible to look at. So governance is really at the heart of the development agenda.
We'll have to move on, and we'll have to keep it a bit short because we do have a lot of questions to move through. But Biman, there's a question that I'll put to you from Willie Lahari, the Solomon Islands Ministry of Finance, from the Solomon Islands.
That's one of my PhDs.
Oh, there you go. Well, appropriate that it's that I direct it to you. One of the long-term challenges for Pacific Islanders is the challenge for closer economic integration. What's your view on a Pacific Islands currency or monetary union or Melanesian union?
Well, I don't see a currency union as a option in the near future, and I think there are a lot of issues around currency union that will have to be addressed. So I don't really want to spend a lot of time on that. But as I said earlier, I think the issue of economic integration and looking at key areas of addressing those constraints for economic integration is very, very important, and one that I think needs an absolute urgent attention is ICT. And the availability of broadband connection and how Pacific Island countries can use that to what I consider, you know, looking at those limited choice of weightless, export products, providing those professional services and making sure that the Pacific builds a comparative advantage around those to be able to do so. But let me just come back quickly to the question of political institutions and political instability. And Ferid and I were talking about that book, Why Nations Fail. And I can give you an example of Fiji. Fiji and Mauritius in 1985-86, almost at the same level of development with the same level of development indicators. We had a coup in 1987, and since then Fiji has experienced political instability for the last 25 years. The average growth in the last 25 years has been less than 2%. Mauritius, on the other hand, grew at more than 5% for 25 years. And today they provide free health to all the citizens, including heart surgery, free education from preschool right up to the university. 87% of Mauritians own their own homes. And if you look at the graphs of GDP growth, investment, savings, you can see a very, very clear relationship without fancy econometrics, where periods of political instability and where we went down. So I think it's incumbent upon political leaders in the Pacific to understand that good political institutions and political stability is absolutely vital for addressing any of those constraints to grow and to address some of the issues that we talked about in making sure that we improve at the end of the day the quality of life of people. So really, I think Pacific governments have to. We really have no choice. We can't afford political instability because it is absolutely important that we have that, because that will guarantee that we are able to address other concerns and problems and challenges that we have as a region.
Thanks. There was a question in the audience.
Anne-Marie O'Keefe, Acting Director, Melanesia Program, Lowy Institute. Thank you very much for your presentations. It's been very interesting, but I actually want to challenge you on a couple of points, and I suppose support Ralph in some of the points he was making. One of you've made an emphasis of the isolation of the countries in the Pacific, and that's the first thing I want to challenge. When you look at the bulk of the population in the Pacific, they are in Melanesia, and those countries are not isolated, far from it. They are very much located very close to very mature economies. PNG in particular is very close to Australia, but it's also very, very close to Asia. It's next door to Indonesia. Vanuatu is only a couple of hours by air to any number of Australian capitals. It's the same with Solomon Islands. Fiji, of course, has its own special circumstances, but it is not isolated either. So I think we tend to use that as an excuse. It's been a long-term excuse, and I think it should actually be debunked. We need to see what the Pacific is actually, what you're dealing with in the Pacific are countries with major populations and major opportunities, but you do have some microstates, and they don't have the critical mass that's required to become economies in a modern sense. You have a country like Tuvalu. It doesn't have the critical mass of population, but nor does it have the critical mass of geographic land to be able to support bigger populations. So I think what we've done here is sort of put everybody into the same basket. And if there's one region of the world where you really cannot put them in the same basket, even several baskets, it's the Pacific. So I think that's a comment rather than a question.
I don't think we disagree with that. I don't think we were saying that Pacific region is a homogeneous region by any shape or size.
Thank you. That's true. Before we come back to the audience here, there's a question from Sebastian Ilala, who's a private businessman in Honiara. And perhaps Ferid or Biman, you can answer this. The Forum Government countries are pushing for PACER Plus. I'll get you to tell us what that is as well. Does the panel think that PACER Plus will work in the Pacific?
I think Rob should be answering.
All right, Rob. What is PESA Plus?
I think Biman's probably
Biman,
the
go
best
on.
place.
Well, PESA, Pacific Agreement on Closer Economic Relations, and that agreement has already been signed. What we're really looking at is the plus. And the agreement was that if Pacific Island countries did enter into any other agreement, and once the interim agreement with the European Union was signed by Fiji and Papua New Guinea, PESA Plus negotiations were triggered. And my own view, I mean, I know a lot of people disagree with that, is that we have a great opportunity in negotiating a very good PESA Plus agreement with Australia and New Zealand. And I think a lot of the issues that we talked about and a lot of the concerns that Pacific Island countries have at times with Australia and New Zealand can be addressed as part of those negotiations. And my own view is that the Pacific Island countries, particularly trade officials and governments, are aware. I think they are putting in a lot of effort to understand the analysis and the outcomes and the processes behind those negotiations. And it is possible, if that is done in an effective and efficient way, that it may be a step closer to the kind of economic integration, meaningful economic integration that we are talking about with Australia and New Zealand. So I see it as a positive development, a development where we have opportunity to negotiate and put on the table in an open and transparent way what Pacific Island countries expect from Australia and New Zealand, and what, on the other hand, Australia and New Zealand expect from the Pacific in terms of addressing the economic challenges that we face. So I think it's an important
Before we move on, there's another one for you, Biman, from Ninga Brino, another small business owner in Honiara. What can you say about having protected industries reserved for nationals and allow foreign investments to concentrate on large-scale ones, bringing with them the technology that we need?
Well, I think there is room for some kind of protection, some kind of support, and it doesn't have to be in terms of tariff protection, it doesn't have to be in terms of subsidies. The support and the environment could come in different ways. Let me just say a little bit about protection, and I think that is where I talk about this anti-growth coalition with monopolies, with business interest, where civil services within the region work in the interest of those who live behind the guarded walls, well-cared homes, and a lot of the tariff protection and the support given to large businesses actually do damage and reduce the welfare of a large number of consumers in these countries. And I think this is what we need to understand when we talk about trade integration, when we talk about opening up. So I think we have to be careful. While I support very strongly the idea of making sure that we bring small and medium enterprises, looking at domestic entrepreneurs, but supporting them to open up, to compete, to derive the opportunities and exploit the opportunities that are available through technology, through communication, and other means. So I have no issues with supporting the development of indigenous, domestic, local entrepreneurs, but that should not come at the expense of depriving a large number of consumers who may have access to cheap products from outside the country.
Ralph, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I disagree with that. The cheap price of goods is not a good criteria to base development on. If you want to talk about cheap price of goods, you can go down here and buy any little Chinese thing, for 5 cents. That's not the hallmark of what we're developing for. We're talking about social outcomes. So the unfortunate thing about the whole trade argument is that everything is brought down to the price of goods for the consumer. And that's not what we should be talking about. We should be talking about gainful, meaningful employment, providing niche opportunities for people who have no jobs themselves, instead of providing more productive capacity for companies overseas to export to us. So yeah, I think one of the big arguments used by the sort of pro-trade people is the price of consumer goods, and that's just, I don't know why we're talking about that. That shouldn't be anything to do with what.
Yeah, I think we can disagree. Let me just give you an example of
just briefly, and then
Ralph may disagree with it. When we look at Tana coffee, for example, one of the things that, and Ralph may disagree with me, one of the things that we found out is that the company which produces Tana coffee has a significant protection, in terms of what it does. And basically, the argument is, and a lot of the large monopolies and companies which are associated with government, with politicians, with civil service, actually use this argument very, very well. They say, we're protecting jobs for 200 people. When in fact, if you reduce the protection for them, you could actually open up businesses which may employ, instead of 200, it may employ more than 500 people, but at the same time providing opportunities for people to exploit cheaper imported goods. And I disagree with Ralph. I think you can talk about certain goods. I mean, there are issues of dumping and people relying on imported food, but there are a lot of things that are imported that are critical to the welfare of the consumers. And in some of those areas, we can see that the protection itself has actually pushed the price at a level where these people are living in poverty, and the prices for which they pay is actually quite exorbitant, simply because you have the protection. So I think that welfare loss and what we call in economics the deadweight loss, I mean the inefficiency loss as a result of that is very important. I don't disagree with Ralph that we need to look at the poor, those who are in the traditional economy. Those are the responsibility of governments and how they make legislations, how they develop the social welfare programs. I think all that can be addressed within the means of a country's ability to achieve sustainable level of growth, at the same time addressing the issues of the quality of life and other indicators of development. We are not saying, an economist like myself, I mean, I would be the last person to say that growth per se is growth is the panacea for all social ills in any country. I think it is not. I mean, you need much more than economic growth, so I don't dispute that. But I think there are issues where we have fundamental problems when you talk about the kind of protection. I'm not talking about the protection for small, medium, vulnerable groups who need the support. I think it's all given. But I'm talking about those big businesses who are very close to politicians, government, civil service, who exploit the regulatory environment and the protection against the wishes of or the welfare of the consumers.
And this type of protection is another way of talking about subsidies.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we are subsidizing people who don't deserve to be subsidized. Yes, good to make sure that those vulnerable, get a sense of targeted subsidies, but having a kind of a blanket subsidy for everybody through protection, for instance, is a very bad idea.
Ralph, would you like to briefly add anything to that?
A lot of people are subsidized. There's a lot of subsidies.
All right,
in various sectors.
Let's move on. There's a question to both Ferid and Ralph from the Solomons. Ferid, first from you, how best can traditional and cash economies development be coordinated?
My ideas are a bit stuck on that one, but I guess, we need to maintain some kind of a balance. Obviously, this is the whole purpose of this discussion, to try to see where can the gap, if any, can it be bridged between traditional economies or frankly the traditional way of conducting the business of a society and the cash economy and the kind of westernized or modern way of conducting the business of a society. In many countries, the synthesis of the two are the key to success. I am not sure that going one way or the other, ignoring the other part is the best way forward. So I guess both of them should work together very, very closely. And hope that we can bring enough synergy between these two ways of managing one country's economy to move forward.
Ralph, do you think one is exclusive to the other, or can they be synthesized?
No, we need to maintain our traditional economy, because it's the only thing that's kept us going all these thousands of years. We've just entered this cash economy, and we can see what it does in other countries. Lots of dangers. That's our security, right? Maintaining it. And the way to do it is by maintaining customary land ownership. That's the basis. Customary land ownership is the basis of the traditional economy, because the traditional economy is a bad way to say it, really, because it's a tradition-based economy, but the way it's run is by modern people, right? We're living today, we're running it, we're using mobile phones and stuff, but it's based on a customary land base, which is owned in a communal way. So we need to amend our laws, which is what we're trying to do in Vanuatu. That's our political agenda. Amend our laws so that they reflect and protect that capacity to have customary land, but have it in a way that customary groups like tribes, clans, can then make decisions and interact with the cash economy, because we need the cash economy. I mean, there's no question about that. It's not either or, as you were saying, but it's more have a base and then build upon that base and build upon those strengths we already have. And the issue with land, why I refer to land, because the alienation of land from customary land ownership is the way in which you have cash economy development at the expense of the traditional economy. So if you are able to safeguard that customary land and have cash economy development on top of that, then you have both.
Can I ask a genuine question? Not that yours were not genuine. When discussing the issue of traditional economies, one idea is to say, look, people pushing this are actually for the preservation of the status quo, and that status quo may actually involve, an arrangement of social classes that people don't want to touch. And moving from that type of a society to a more of a cash economy would actually disrupt that order, and that order may not necessarily be a just order. So the question is, how can one answer that kind of a criticism?
Well, one good way to answer it is that traditional economies in the Pacific are equitable. There's no one in poverty, absolutely no one with nothing to eat, nobody without land. I mean, there are even there's extreme cases of perhaps I don't know, someone, particularly a woman, a vulnerable woman like a widow or something, traditionally, who would have been maybe excluded. But in most societies, no one can be excluded. Basically,
they're not hierarchical, or the traditional land ownership, is it hierarchical at all?
Well, it's inclusive. It's about access. You have access to land to make a garden, right? You may not own the land, but you have access. Cash economy, that's when you start getting haves and have-nots. That's when you start getting absolute poverty, and we see it in the Pacific, in traditional economies, generally traditional economies. You don't have the situation in Port Vila, for example, where you're starting to see glimpses of homelessness, glimpses of people with very little to eat, eating very bad food because it's the cheapest food they can buy. So I think you need to balance that, and I think in a traditional economy it doesn't mean you maintain a traditional social structure. These economies we're talking about, I suppose you can say it's more community rule-based economy is evolving, and a good example is in Vanuatu. Now, the majority of chiefs, so-called chiefs, because chiefs is a colonial thing, right? It's not a traditional thing. It's a colonial construct that has now been absorbed, and it's now part of our culture. The majority of chiefs now in Vanuatu are elected annually, right? So, and then the idea of chiefs' councils is evolving, and we have now legislation at the state level which says chiefs can be anyone, like women can be chiefs, and authority is devolved to a council rather than an individual. And so trying to integrate what's happening in the community with what's happening at the state with this legislation and bring it down, at the same time I mean, the traditional economy doesn't mean static. Far from it. We've been evolving for thousands of years, you know.
Biman, do you see problems with private sector development getting involved in working with customary land ownership, or is it?
Before that, Olivia, just my sort of idea about relating the traditional economy. You know, I think there is a whole literature on creative economy. You know, how traditional products, traditional artifacts, traditional music, traditional ways of developing products can be used to put people into the cash economy where they can earn income. I think it's the whole creative economy that can be built around traditional products, traditional ways of doing things, making sure that those traditional products get accepted and tested and marketed in a way that can promote the cash economy, yet maintain some of the traditional practices and ways of doing things. So I mean that's one other way of sort of relating to the traditional economy. I have difficulty with the land ownership idea. I think the assumption behind that the communities would be able to deal with those issues in an equitable way. I mean, Fiji is a good example. And I think Ralph gave a very good example of what's happening in Vanuatu, where the election of chiefs and the way it's being dealt with is different. I think the assumption that it was equitable, it was fair, perhaps is not entirely correct. I think there was quite a lot of injustice in some of the traditional systems of land ownership and how the benefits were distributed to the ordinary members of the community or the land owning unit. So this idea that we can marry the two, easily, in my view, is going to be very difficult. I think we need to look at much better and perhaps more inclusive institutions that govern land ownership. I'm not talking about land alienation here. I think we can talk about land ownership, land leasing systems, which can address some of those inequities that might exist in the traditional system, but also help integrate people into the modern economy so that the benefits of utilizing the land is for the greater good. I mean, it's not restricted to particular communities or particular groups or particular regions. I think land is a national resource, and as a country, leaders ought to be looking at that as a national resource and making sure that the institutions governing that resource is to the benefit of all the people in the country.
We only have 5 minutes left, but I'd like to go to you, Rob. What role do you see traditional, or how do you see AID working alongside traditional economies?
I think it can, they're definitely not mutually exclusive, and I think there's a range of possibilities. And this theme that we've been talking about today, the Pacific Island communities have a range of choices in terms of the path that they might follow in terms of their own development. And the traditional sector, the traditional authority, traditional economy, I think has got a really important role to play. Land is crucial, and land is everything in Pacific Island communities. And we see that in particular at the peri-urban fringe, and the issues around urbanisation, young people in particular moving to towns who are looking for work, may not find it, they don't have land, and if you don't have land and you don't have a job, you don't have anything. And I think this is a really important thing for policymakers to be focusing on into the future. The Pacific character of urbanisation, we see it in Vila, we see it in Moresby, we see it in the peri-urban fringe in Honiara, a big future challenge for all policymakers. But there's opportunities too in terms of working with traditional authorities, and I'll give you some examples. In the law and justice sector, something that the Australian Aid program has been trialling is working with traditional authorities on remand and management of correction arrangements. So we started the discussion today talking about the cost of service delivery and the difficulties for Pacific Island governments to manage all of the elements of governance institutions of the modern state. And I think there's some, when we talk about development in the Pacific, there's a range of choices, whether it's regional solutions to service delivery, whether it's the role of the private sector in delivery of services, traditional authority and traditional communities. Traditional authorities definitely got a role to play, and certainly we'd like to see some more testing and trialling of that. And we've seen it in PNG. We've tested these things in Solomon Islands, and Ralph might have some observations about the scope for working with traditional authority in Vanuatu as well.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. It seems that an extra half hour is not enough time for this topic, but I'd like to thank our audiences and also our panellists, Rob Tranter, Biman, Prasad, Ferid, Belhaj, and Ralph Regenvanu. Thank you very much. And I'll see you again in a month's time for the next Praxis. And if you'd like to download editions of Praxis past or present, go to theworldbank.org/Praxis.